The Ku Klux Klan has been linked with some of the worst crimes that have ever been committed on American soil. From mob attacks and lynching to modern-day white supremacist crimes, racism still runs deep in the United States. But these cases provide poetic justice. Here are KKK members reacting to sentencing.
Once you talk to James for a while, you would start that sympathy towards Nazism, that idolation of Hitler, that belief in white supremacy. It would start to creep out. Refer it up to
James Alex Fields, Jr. In August 2017, 20-year-old James Alex Fields traveled from Ohio to Charlottesville, Virginia, to attend the Unite the Right rally, which is exactly what it sounds like. Charlottesville had seen a surge in right-wing politics, especially white supremacist movements, after plans of destroying Confederate statues were announced. The first protest occurred in July, after which the Unite the Right rally was planned over August 11th and 12th. This sparked a wave of counter-protests from all across Virginia, leading to tensions between the two groups that eventually turned violent. Before James's attack on August 17th, there had been clashes between protesters and counter-protesters, and the city of Charlottesville was on high alert. But no one expected the 20-year-old to ram his vehicle into a group of protesters. According to witnesses, James's vehicle reached a top speed of approximately 45 miles per hour when he rammed into the group. He then backed up and attacked more protesters before fleeing the scene. When he was apprehended, he started crying, claiming that he was sorry. One person passed away from the incident, 20 were rushed to the hospital, and at least 5 people had critical injuries.
Would proclaim himself as a Nazi.
In school.
In court, the prosecution claimed that James was not sorry for what he had done. They called witnesses going back to his middle school days, who testified that James had radical views ever since he was a child. An old history teacher also claimed that James had a long list of mental disorders, including anger management issues, schizophrenia, and bipolar personality disorder.
You haven't been notified at all about this?
No.
Wow. So this is the first you're learning of it.
On more than a few occasions, police were also called to the Fields' residence, where he stayed with his mother after he had allegedly attacked her. About 2 years before the Charlottesville attack, James had moved out of his home and had minimal contact with his mother. Prosecutors announced they would be charging James with vehicular manslaughter as well as hate crimes and domestic terrorism. In 2019, James was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 400 years to be served before being eligible for parole. Effectively, James Alex Fields Jr. will never see the light of day again. James Jackson. On March 20th, 2017, 66-year-old Timothy Corman was collecting cans to recycle in the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood of Manhattan, New York. He was approached by 28-year-old James Jackson, who, without any provocation, began attacking him repeatedly with an 18-inch sword. Earlier, James had traveled from Maryland to New York specifically for the attack. After investigators found Timothy's body, they launched a manhunt for the perpetrator, which ended 2 days later when James turned himself over to the police. The attack seemed completely random, and investigators were keen to understand why James had specifically targeted Timothy. They were shocked to learn that it was, in fact, random, and that James only attacked Timothy because he was a black man. He also claimed that he had made the trip from Maryland to New York to find black men to unalive. His motive was to stop interracial relationships between black men and white women. When he turned himself in, James claimed that he had planned on unaliving as many as 10 more black men in the region before eventually traveling back to Maryland.
Or anything near what the allegations are, then we're going to address the obvious psychological issues that are present in this case. That's all we have to say at this time, and thank you.
In police interviews, James revealed that he had started developing racist and Nazi ideologies when he was 3 years old, and that he would only share his views with like-minded people, especially since he came from a very liberal household. James had also served in the military and was honorably discharged, winning several accolades for his service. Despite his otherwise normal outward life, James told police that he had been fantasizing about unaliving black men for decades. When asked why he specifically traveled to New York for the attack, James claimed that he believed he would be able to make a bigger statement in the state. He also expressed his regret for targeting Timothy, claiming that he would have preferred unaliving someone younger or older and richer. The judge and members of the jury were appalled at James's comments and sentenced him to serve a life sentence without parole. Dylan Roof. On June 17, 2015, a 21-year-old Dylan Roof walked into the historic Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in downtown Charleston, South Carolina. The church, known affectionately as Mother Emmanuel, was hosting a Wednesday night Bible study. Dylan, a young white man, was welcomed inside by the predominantly black congregation and even sat right next to the church's pastor. For approximately 45 minutes, Dylan sat quietly among the group, listening and observing. But just as the parishioners closed their eyes for a final prayer, Dylan drew a .45 caliber handgun and opened fire. He unalived 9 people and injured a 10th, before calmly walking out of the church. The brutal attack sent shockwaves across the nation. A massive manhunt ensued, and the very next morning, police apprehended Dylan during a traffic stop in Shelby, North Carolina, nearly 250 miles away from the crime scene. During his FBI interrogation, Dylan did not hesitate to confess to the horrifying crime. He casually admitted that he had been planning the attack for months, conducting online research to specifically target the oldest black church in the South. When investigators asked him why, Dylan bluntly stated that he wanted to ignite a massive race war in the United States. He claimed he had been completely self-radicalized after reading white supremacist propaganda and neo-Nazi ideologies online. Chillingly, when agents informed him that 9 people had passed away, Dylan seemed genuinely surprised, arguing that he did not think he had unalived that many people. He even told investigators that he almost didn't go through with the attack at all because the church members had been so exceptionally nice to him when he walked in.
White people are pretending like we are all the same and equal. I could not go another day without doing something. It was worth it. It isn't up to me anymore.
In court, Dylan's sheer lack of remorse became even more apparent. He ultimately chose to represent himself during the sentencing phase of his federal trial, outright refusing to call witnesses or allow his defense team to argue that he suffered from any sort of mental illness. In a journal read to the jury, he explicitly stated that he felt he had to do it, and that he still felt he had to do it. In a moment of profound grace that sharply contrasted with Dylan's cold demeanor, the victims' families famously stood up during his initial bond hearing and offered him their forgiveness. In early 2017, a federal jury formally sentenced Dylan to death for 33 federal hate crimes and civil rights violations. He later pleaded guilty to state unaliving charges to avoid a second capital penalty trial, receiving 9 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He currently sits on federal Capitol Row.
To carry out the sentence of death by lethal injection as provided by Kansas law.
One day, my spirit will rise from my grave and you all know that I was right.
Fraser Glenn Miller Jr. Up until Fraser Glenn's arrest in 2014 for the Overland Park shooting, he had been the leader of the White Patriot Party, a paramilitary political party that advocated for white supremacy and segregation from all other ethnic groups. The White Patriot Party had formerly been known as the Carolina Knights, and even long before that was a branch of the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. Fraser had once served in the United States military and was formally discharged after 20 years of service for promoting white supremacist ideologies and distributing propaganda material. In 1980, he founded the White Patriot Party in North Carolina. He tried unsuccessfully to run for governor of North Carolina and had even self-published an autobiography, A White Man Speaks Out. Later, after the Overland shooting incident, his autobiography was presented in court, and in the very introduction of the book, Fraser asked that if Jews can have their separate state, then why could white Christians not have the same? Fraser had a deep loathing for the United States' growing Jewish community. After trying to publish several newsletters, writing to government officials, and trying to gain support for his views and failing, Fraser decided to do something about it himself. On April 13, 2014, Fraser traveled to the Jewish Community Center in Kansas City, where he opened fire. He managed to unalive 3 people, seriously injuring several others during the attack.
My evidences will include articles from Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, New York Times, Fox TV News, CNN TV News, Time Magazine, and many other similar sources that come from the mainstream media. And also,
allegedly, Fraser yelled Nazi slogans throughout the attack. Ironically, however, None of the people Fraser had unalived were Jewish. They were all Christians. In court, Fraser claimed that his racist ideas came to a head in March 2014 when he was diagnosed with emphysema and told that he only had a few years left to live. This was his way of accomplishing his mission before he passed away. Fraser also decided to represent himself in court and would go on hour-long tangents, justifying his actions. In 2015, the court found him responsible for the unalivings and sentenced him to capital punishment. However, in 2021, Fraser passed away at the age of 80.
A federal appeals court overturns the conviction of this man, reputed Ku Klux Klan leader James Ford Seal, serving 3 life sentences for his role in a 1964
James Ford Seal. In May 1964, 2 19-year-old black men, Henry Hezekiah D. and Charles Eddie Moore, were hitchhiking near Meadville, Mississippi. The 2 childhood friends were suddenly approached by members of the local Ku Klux Klan, including a man named James Ford Seal. James, pretending to be a federal revenue agent, forced the teenagers into his vehicle. The Klansmen falsely suspected the young men of storing firearms for a potential militant uprising and abducted them right off the road. James and his accomplices drove the teenagers deep into the Homachito National Forest. There, they tied the boys to a tree and brutally beat them with long wooden beanstalk sticks, violently demanding information they simply did not have. After relentlessly torturing the boys, the Klansmen shoved Henry and Charles, who were completely unconscious but still breathing, into the cramped trunk of James's car. They then drove them across state lines to a remote launch on the Mississippi River. James and the other men chained the still-living teenagers to heavy iron engine blocks and railroad ties before throwing them into the water. Local law enforcement, which was heavily colluding with the Klan at the time, completely ignored the disappearances. The boys' mangled bodies were only discovered 2 months later by federal divers, who were desperately searching the river for 3 other missing civil rights workers in the infamous Mississippi burning case.
Closing arguments in the federal trial of James Ford Seal have come and gone. The verdict now lies with the jury. They'll decide whether the former Klansman is guilty on charges of conspiracy and kidnapping in the 1964 murders of 2 black teens.
Though James was briefly arrested in late 1964, the corrupt local justice system quickly dismissed the charges, claiming a lack of evidence. For over 4 decades, the families lived without justice, and the community eventually believed James had passed away. However, in 2005, Charles's brother Thomas, alongside a Canadian documentary filmmaker, shockingly discovered that James was very much alive and living completely off the radar in a town right next door. Armed with this new evidence, the FBI immediately reopened the cold case. At trial, a fellow Klansman testified against James in exchange for immunity, detailing exactly how the young men were unalived. In 2007, 43 years after the horrific crime, a 71-year-old James Ford Seal was finally found guilty of federal kidnapping and conspiracy charges. He was sentenced to 3 life terms in prison, where he eventually passed away in 2011.
It took more than 40 years to bring Ku Klux Klansman Edgar Ray Killen to justice for the 1964 murders of civil rights workers James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman in Mississippi. Killen died last night in prison, where he was serving 3 consecutive life terms. He was 92.
Edgar Ray Killen. The United States was going through a revolutionary period in the 1960s. With the civil rights movement in full swing, there were racial tensions all across the country. Protesters and counter-protesters battled it out in the streets, especially during the 1964 Freedom Summer. Among the neo-Nazis who had grown even more paranoid during the civil rights movement was Edgar Ray Killen, a recruiter and organizer for the Ku Klux Klan. Under the instruction of Grand Wizard Samuel Bowers, Edgar, a deputy sheriff, and altogether 15 members of the KKK, unalived 3 members of the civil rights movement, 1 black man and 2 Jewish men, in Philadelphia, Mississippi. The 15 men were arrested and tried in 1966. 7 were convicted, and 8 were released without any charges being filed against them. In Edgar's case, the jury believed that he should not be prosecuted since he was also a Baptist minister. It should also be noted that the jury consisted of an all-white panel. None of the convicted members of the KKK received more than 6 years in prison for the unalivings. 20 years after he was acquitted of the charges, journalist Jerry Mitchell convinced Edgar to sit down for an interview. Competent and realizing that times had changed in the United States, Edgar still held on to his racist views and openly professed them and the unalivings. This led to renewed interest in the case, but it still was not until much later, in 2005, when a group of activists lobbied for the retrials of the unalivers during the 60s civil rights movement.
And the decisions are made are so important. They're difficult decisions on the part of the court, the part of the attorneys in the case, and the jurors themselves. It's a difficult decision when they realize that whatever they do will affect the lives or liberties of someone regardless of what.
They petitioned the court to reopen the case against Edgar, and while the jury believed that the 80-year-old was not guilty of unaliving the three men, there was overwhelming evidence that he had recruited members of the KKK to instigate the mob violence, which eventually led to their passing. Edgar, at 80 years old, was sentenced to 60 years in prison, 20 years each for the unalivings. In 2018, on his 93rd birthday, Edgar Ray Killen passed away in prison. James L. Jones, Claude Fuller, and Ernest Avance. On June 10, 1966, three members of the Ku Klux Klan, James L. Jones, Claude Fuller, and Ernest Avance, lured 67-year-old caretaker of the Carter family farm, Ben Chester White, in Natchez, Mississippi. The men hung out with Ben, buying him a soda, and then taking him to the national park, where they promised they would help him look for his lost dog. However, once they had lured Ben to the woods, they shot him 18 times. His body was then dumped into the creek, and the vehicle used was burned. A few days after the crime, James confessed his involvement to the police. While investigators arrested all three men in connection to the crime, James and Claude were never tried, whereas Ernest was tried and acquitted of the charges. In court, the prosecutors argued that the three men had hoped to lure Martin Luther King Jr. to Natchez, Mississippi, believing Ben was a member of the civil rights movement as well. Their ultimate plan was to unalive the face of the movement. However, Ben was largely uninvolved in the movement, and his children described him as an unassuming old man who was just doing his best every day. Even though the all-white jury found the three men not guilty of the crimes, Ben's children successfully sued Ernest for financial damages, while the money, $1 million, was never paid. This was the first time in history that the KKK was asked to pay restitution for its crimes. For decades, Ben's family believed that there would be no justice for their father. However, the case received renewed interest in 2000, when investigators revealed that the 67-year-old caretaker was unalived on federal property, making this a federal crime and retrying Ernest Avance. In 2003, Ernest was found guilty of first-degree unaliving by a federal jury in Mississippi and sentenced to life in prison. He passed away in prison on June 14, 2004.
I also knew that 4 little girls, not much older than myself, had been murdered at the 16th Street Baptist Church when a bomb ripped through the basement, awakening the nation and the world to the horrors of race-based violence and oppression.
Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr., Herman Frank Cash, Robert Edward Chambliss, and Bobby Frank Cherry. On the morning of September 15, 1963, the congregation of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, was actively preparing for Sunday service. The church was a prominent rallying place for civil rights leaders, which unfortunately made it a constant target in a city so plagued by racially motivated attacks that it had earned the nickname Bombingham. It was Youth Day, and at 10:22 in the morning, just before prayers were set to begin, a massive explosion violently ripped through the church's rear wall.
Surviving bomber of the 16th Street Baptist Church will go before the parole board next week.
And the NAACP wants to make sure that Thomas Blanton stays in prison.
Earlier that morning, 4 members of the Ku Klux Klan, Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr., Herman Frank Cash, Robert Edward Chambliss, and Bobby Frank Cherry, had planted at least 19 sticks of dynamite equipped with a timer under the steps right outside the church's basement. The blast completely destroyed the steps and blew a passing motorist out of his car. Tragically, 4 young girls passed away: 14-year-olds Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley, along with 11-year-old Carol Denise McNair. A 5th girl, Addie Mae's sister Sarah, survived but lost her right eye.
Birmingham, Alabama. On May 27, 2002, nearly 4 decades after one of the most horrifying acts of racial violence during the American Civil Rights Movement.
Despite the FBI identifying the 4 Klansmen early on, witnesses were too terrified to testify, physical evidence was limited, and a highly biased local justice system stalled the case. It was not until decades later, after the FBI reopened the cold case with new evidence, that true justice was served for the remaining perpetrators. It ultimately took 14 years for the first conviction. In 1977, Robert Chambliss, known locally as Dynamite Bob, was found guilty of unaliving and sentenced to life in prison. Herman Frank Cash passed away in 1994 before he could be formally charged. Thomas Blanton Jr. was tried and convicted in 2001, followed by Bobby Frank Cherry in 2002. Both men were sentenced to life in prison.
That scar runs along Huff Creek Road. It's where James Byrd Jr. was chained to the back of this pickup truck, then dragged for 3 miles by 3 white men. His body was found here, torn apart.
John William King, Lawrence Russell Brewer, and Sean Allen Berry. Probably one of the most horrific crimes carried out by white supremacists in today's video, the 1998 dragging and unaliving of 49-year-old James Byrd in Jasper, Texas. On June 7th, James accepted a ride from Sean Berry, whom he was acquainted with. Also in the truck were Lawrence Russell and John William King. Sean and John were 23 at the time of the crime, and Lawrence was 32 years old. After accepting the ride, the 3 men took James to a remote area where they beat him severely and then tied him by his ankles to the back of the vehicle. The men had also allegedly slashed his throat before dragging him for 5 kilometers across the area. However, according to the coroner's report, James was conscious throughout most of the ride. He passed away around 2.5 miles later after severing his right arm. The 3 men then continued to drag James's body for another 2.5 kilometers before eventually dumping his mutilated remains in front of an African-American cemetery.
To death.
John William King was one of 3 men convicted in the dragging death of James Byrd Jr. in Jasper, Texas in 1998. Byrd was chained to the back of a truck, and the 3 men dragged him 3 miles down.
According to court documents, the 3 men then went and attended a barbecue and acted as if nothing had happened. If anything, they laughed and socialized throughout the night, almost as if they were proud of the gruesome crime they had just committed. James's remains were found the next day, and police mapped out the possible trail where they found evidence tying them back to the 3 men. Since they knew that Lawrence and John were well-known white supremacists in the area, they started building a hate crime case against the trio. All 3 men were tried for the crime, with Sean being the only one who showed any remorse. John and Lawrence had met while serving prison time, connected through their racist views, and then hatched a plan together to unalive black men across Jasper. Sean's defense team claimed that he was an unwilling participant, but the prosecution pointed out that he had been the one to slash James's throat in the first place.
He always said that through his music, that one day I'm gonna put Jasper, Texas on the map, just wait and see. And then it would be that he put Jasper on the map, but it wasn't.
He was sentenced to life in prison, whereas John and Lawrence were sentenced to capital punishment. In 2011, John was executed via lethal injection, and Lawrence was executed in the same manner in 2019. Meanwhile, Sean is still serving a life sentence with eligibility for parole when he is 63 years old. He is confined to a cell 23 hours a day and receives only 1 hour outside for exercise. Right before he was executed, John said, "As far as any regrets, no, I have no regrets. No, I would do it all over again, to tell you the truth." Samuel Bowers, one of the most prolific members of the Ku Klux Klan and one of the worst white supremacist criminals in the United States history.
There were some elements out there that didn't appreciate my father's involvement in the civil rights movement, and they had expressed that by harassing telephone calls, burning down his hay barn, and numerous other things that they did to let him know, look, you're doing the wrong thing, you better stop.
Samuel Bowers, one of the most prolific members of the Ku Klux Klan and one of the worst white supremacist criminals in the United States history, Samuel Bowers was the KKK's first Grand Wizard and a prominent member of the White Knights. Born and raised in a racist household, Samuel detested the civil rights movement and believed that intermixing races would lead to devastating results for the United States and Christianity as a whole. With his position as a Grand Wizard, Samuel influenced many crimes against ethnic minorities during the 60s. He was the instigator behind the unalivings of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner in Philadelphia, Mississippi, the 1960 bombings on Jewish sites, and ultimately the unaliving of civil rights activist Vernon Dahmer. Vernon was a white-passing, African-American man who had dedicated his life to the civil rights movement. He believed that blacks deserved the right to vote just as much as anyone else, and rallied to get them that right. However, this meant that Vernon and his family would receive threats throughout his time as an activist. In 1966, while sleeping in shifts because of the threats, the family awoke to gunshots, gas jugs being thrown, and the smell of a fire on their property. 14 members of the Ku Klux Klan had attacked Vernon's residence, where he lived with his wife and children. While the family managed to escape the burning home, Vernon would later pass away at the hospital from smoke inhalation. Vernon also owned and operated a grocery store where he hired white and black employees. The KKK members burned down his store as well. While all 14 men were tried, most of them were acquitted, and everyone who was charged was released soon afterward. It was not until 1998 that investigators arrested the main accused, Samuel Bowers, of instigating and planning the unaliving of Vernon Dahmer. He was arrested, charged, and sentenced to life in prison. Allegedly, only one person visited Samuel from the time he was arrested until he eventually passed away in 2006. He had no family members and no children. Only a distant relative came to receive his body after he passed away, old and alone at the age of 82.
But I was so mentally ill and crazy, that's the type of thing I was led into, through Nazism.
Do you think you deserve to die?
Well, to tell you the truth, I actually think I do, yeah.
Joseph Paul Franklin. Between 1977 and 1980, Joseph Paul Franklin drifted through states, committing armed robberies and serial unaliving people. In his youth, Joseph had joined the Ku Klux Klan, and his targets included black men, their white girlfriends, Jews, and people he believed were lenient towards interracial mixing. His crimes started in 1977 when he bombed a synagogue in Tennessee, followed by shooting and unaliving a young interracial couple, and then shooting Jewish men outside of another synagogue, unaliving one of them and critically injuring another. In 1978, Joseph shot at Larry Flynt, the founder of an adult magazine, for promoting interracial relations. Larry survived the attack, but was paralyzed from the waist down. That same year, Joseph shot at another young interracial couple, unaliving the young black man. He then committed 4 unalivings in 1979, 3 black men and a white woman. Joseph was finally arrested and tried in 1980 after he was found to be the man responsible for attacking civil rights activist Vernon Jordan.
You were serving consecutive life sentences for some murders when you decided to confess to the Richmond Heights sniping and got the death sentence. Why did you decide to confess?
Well, I had a dream that told me to confess to the Richmond Heights case.
Vernon survived the attack, and police launched an investigation, but by the time they apprehended Joseph, he had already committed more unalivings, 2 teenage cousins, an interracial couple, 2 white women he accused of sympathizing with blacks, and 2 black men he saw in a park. He was finally apprehended after crossing over states once again in Missouri with an unregistered firearm in his vehicle. Joseph confessed to his crimes, was tried, and found guilty. The judge believed that he was a danger to society, while his defense team brought a psychologist to testify, claiming that Joseph was a paranoid schizophrenic who was not fit to stand trial. Nevertheless, the judge believed Joseph was a violent racist who knew exactly what he was doing. In 2013, at the age of 63, Joseph Paul Franklin was executed via lethal injection.
Let me say this to you. I had one merchant to call me, and he said, "We don't need nigger business. So let us not trade at these stores. Let's let the merchants down on Capitol Street feel the economic pinch."
Byron de la Beckwith. On the night of June 12, 1963, 37-year-old Medgar Evers, a prominent civil rights leader, pulled into his driveway in Jackson. Just hours earlier, the nation had watched President John Kennedy deliver a historic national address on civil rights. As Medgar stepped out of his car, carrying a bundle of t-shirts that read, "Jim Crow must go," a sniper hidden in a nearby bush fired a single shot from a high-powered rifle. The bullet struck Medgar in the back, right in front of his wife and young children. He passed away at the local hospital less than an hour later. The weapon abandoned at the scene was quickly traced back to Byron de la Beckwith, a radicalized white supremacist and a founding member of the local White Citizens Council. Byron's fingerprint was found right on the scope of the rifle, and multiple witnesses placed his vehicle near the Evers residence on the night of the attack. 1964. Byron was tried twice for the horrific crime. Both times, completely all-white, all-male juries deadlocked, allowing the perpetrator to walk away free. For the next 30 years, Byron lived his life without any fear of consequence. He routinely attended Ku Klux Klan rallies and openly bragged to crowds and associates about how he had successfully unalived Medgar Evers.
Let me say this to you. I had one merchant to call me, and he said, "We don't need nigger business. So let us not trade at these stores. Let's let the merchants down on Capitol Street feel the economic pinch."
NBC News cameras carry Evers' impassioned speech nationwide. 3 weeks later, a gunman shoots him in the back. As a World War II veteran, Evers is buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. His funeral airs on national television. Over 3,000 mourners come to pay their respects. His brother Charles, a fellow activist, comforts his distraught widow Merle and their 2 young children Daryl and Rena.
He genuinely believed that no court in the South would ever hold him accountable. However, Medgar's widow, Merle Evers, refused to give up. Decades later, with the help of investigative journalists and dedicated prosecutors, new evidence was unearthed, including testimony from several people who had personally heard Byron brag about the crime. In 1994, 31 years after the incident, a newly formed, diverse jury finally convicted a 73-year-old Byron. He was swiftly sentenced to life in prison, where he eventually passed away in 2001.
The murder of Michael Donald changed history. He was killed by members of the Ku Klux Klan and hanged in the last lynching in the United States.
Benjamin Cox, James Knowles, Henry Hayes. In March 1981, 19-year-old Michael Donald stepped out of his home in Mobile, Alabama, to run a simple errand and buy a pack of cigarettes for his sister. Meanwhile, across town, members of the United Klans of America were fuming over a recent local trial. A racially mixed jury had just failed to convict an African-American man accused of a crime against a white police officer. Enraged by the mistrial and desperate to send a terrifying message, high-ranking Klan members decided that a completely innocent person had to pay the ultimate price. 2 young Klansmen, 26-year-old Henry Hayes and 17-year-old James Knowles, set out into the night armed with a handgun and a 20-foot yellow nylon rope they had specifically borrowed from fellow Klan member Benjamin Cox. As Henry and James drove through the dark streets looking for a completely random victim, they spotted Michael. Pretending to ask for directions to a local club, they lured the young man to their vehicle before forcing him inside at gunpoint. They then drove Michael deep into the secluded, rural woods of neighboring Baldwin County. Desperate to survive, Michael tried to escape and even managed to knock the gun away, but the 2 men quickly overpowered him. They brutally beat him with a heavy tree branch before Henry strangled him with the rope Benjamin had provided. Henry then slashed his throat. The perpetrators brought Michael's lifeless body back to Mobile and hung it from a tree directly across the street from Henry's own father's house. Initially,
because in that way it helps us to redeem ourselves and to make sure that this horrific event never happens again.
Local law enforcement tried to pass the horrifying incident off as a drug deal gone wrong, completely ignoring the obvious racial motivations. However, Michael's mother, Beulah Mae Donald, refused to let the case go unnoticed. By 1983, the Klan's dark conspiracy finally unraveled. James Knowles fully confessed to the FBI, and agreed to testify against his fellow Klansmen, receiving a life sentence in federal prison in 1985. Henry Hayes was convicted of capital murder, and though the jury recommended life, the judge shockingly stepped in and sentenced him to death. Henry was eventually executed in the electric chair in 1997. Finally, in 1989, Benjamin Cox was also convicted as an accomplice for providing the fatal rope and was sentenced to life in prison. Furthermore, Beulah May Donald filed a monumental civil lawsuit that completely bankrupted the United Klans of America, permanently dismantling the specific organization that took her son's life.
Nearly 100 years before the Me Too movement, it was the tragedy and the courage of one young woman in Irvington that brought down the KKK in Indiana.
David Curtis Stevenson. Times were different in the early to mid-20th century. While racism exists even today, it is largely viewed negatively by the masses. But back in the 20th century, it was not just practiced openly, but also celebrated. Take David Curtis Stevenson's case as an example. He was the leader of the Indiana clan of the KKK and was also appointed as the Grand Dragon of 7 other states. Because of his large following and influence, David became a wealthy man, had political connections, and was largely untouchable. David relocated to Evansville, Indiana, when he was 29 years old, joined the Ku Klux Klan, and successfully recruited nearly 30% of the white male population in the KKK. He eventually started a weekly newsletter promoting harmful rhetoric, viewed by almost every household in Indiana. Soon enough, David became more powerful than the KKK members who had recruited him, causing a rift. Yes, David was a member of the Klan, but he had separated from the national organization and created his own organization when he started disagreeing with Klan members. In David's Klan, there were reportedly 2,000 recruits every week, bringing the total number of Klan members close to 100,000 in 1922. But his downfall came in 1925, when 28-year-old Madge Oberholzer released her final statement to the police while she was passing away. She claimed that David had grown infatuated with her, abducted her, and then harmed her. The wounds were so severe that she had decided to unalive herself. Seeing her in a comatose state, David eventually decided to return her home, but Madge miraculously survived just long enough to give investigators a chronology of what had happened to her. This was the case of the century. Not only was David one of the most prominent men in Indiana at the time of the crime, but the KKK actually upheld a positive image during the early 20th century, with Madge's final testimony before she passed away, detailing the horrors that David had put her through. Everyone turned away from the Klan. The recruits went down from 5 million to several thousand, a massive blow to David's authority.
Since Marion County was so corrupted by the Klan, Stevenson's trial was moved to Noblesville, where he was found guilty of second-degree murder and later served 30 years in prison.
In court, prosecutors argued that David had committed the act because he believed he was untouchable, and this only pushed the judge toward a harsher sentence to show everyone that he was not. In 1925, David was found guilty of abducting, harming, and eventually leading to the unaliving of Madge, and sentenced to life in prison. When he asked the governor for clemency and was refused, David retaliated by revealing a list of public officials who had taken bribes from the Klan, weakening its image even further. David was paroled in 1950 but was rearrested that same year for violating his parole and sentenced to another 10 years in prison. In 1966, he passed away at the age of 74,